So let's now dive into all these important basics and fundamentals. And for that, keep in mind what you learned in the first course section. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And we also learned that, of course, in general, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are about building user interfaces as well. But I also mentioned in the first course section that we use libraries like React because that simplifies building those user interfaces. We don't need it. You can build any website without React. But if you're having more complex user interfaces, like the one we have in this expense tracker, if you use something like React, it all of a sudden becomes much easier to build something like this. You won't have to focus on all the nitty-gritty details, and it will be less error-prone if you use something like React, because you will be able to focus on your core business logic that makes up your application instead of having to focus on the actual steps of updating the page when something happens somewhere. That's why we use libraries like React. And to make that job simpler for us, to make that work simpler for us, React embraces a concept called components. React is all about components. But of course, that brings up one important question. What exactly is a component? Well, let me come back to this question in a second. Instead, let me come back to this first sentence here. Even though we don't fully know yet what components are, why could React be about one concept in its core? Because all user interfaces in the end are made up of components. So what could be a component then if it is something which is crucial in all user interfaces you see? Well, let's have a look at this finished application which we're going to build throughout this and the next course sections. If you have a look at this user interface, at this web application, you might be able to identify a couple of building blocks that make up this interface. For example, have a look at the expense items down there. This, in the end, is the same item being repeated twice here. It's the same item, just with different data. The same would be true, by the way, here for this chart. The individual bars in that chart, that's the same item, just repeated with a different label and a different amount of filling. And that is exactly what components are. Reusable building blocks in your user interface. Components are in the end just a combination of HTML code, CSS code for styling, and possibly JavaScript code for some logic. And you don't have to reuse a component to make it a component. It's just one of its traits that it is reusable. But on this user interface, which you see here, there would be more components than just these expense items and these chart bars. The item here at the top would be a component. If we expand it, this would then be more elements inside of that component. That filter here would be a component. The overall chart would be a component. The overall list of items would be a component. But inside of the items, we could say this date item here would be a separate component. The amount here would be a component. We can really split it up in a very granular way if we want to. We got all these individual building blocks which we combine together to build a user interface. And in the end, of course, all user interfaces can be split up into components like this, into containers and buttons and input elements and product items which are being output, something like that. All user interfaces on all kinds of web applications can be split up into components like this. And React is all about these components. You build these individual components, and then you tell React how to compose them together into a final user interface. And React embraces this concept of components because of that reusability aspect and because it allows us to separate our concerns. Both concepts are important concepts in programming in general. Having reusable building blocks helps us avoid repetition. And in programming in general, it is good if we don't repeat ourselves. Having a separation of concerns helps us with keeping our code base small and manageable. Instead of having one large file which holds all the HTML code and all the JavaScript logic for the entire user interface, we have small separated units, these components, where every component has one clear concern, one focus, one specific task it focuses on. And if we split that code across multiple files, then, as we are going to do it throughout this course, then we'll have small pieces of code which are easy to manage and maintain. And these, of course, are not concepts or ideas React invented. Instead, if we take a step back from React and we think about programming in general, then of course in any programming language, and no matter what you're building, you tend to work with functions. And you split your code into multiple small functions, which then may call each other to outsource logic into a function, to separate concerns, and to be able to execute the same code multiple times if you need to. And React just picks up that concept of functions and of separating code across functions and translates it to the front-end web application world, where we build an entire user interface by splitting our code into multiple components, which we then can mix and match as we need to.